Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Cosmin and Anna, for this invitation. It's incredible to be here, and to everyone at Parasite. So Cosmin and Anna asked me to contextualize a little bit the relationship between dance and visual arts in the current performative turn. And that's what I'll do. And I guess I'll just go into the text. I have a text for you, which is divided in two parts. One a little bit more historical, and the other one a little bit more theoretical, speculative on what's happening, perhaps, right now. And I'll read, and hopefully we'll keep the time frame in time. The title of the essay is Dance, Choreography, and the Visual Elements for a Contemporary Imagination. And it goes like this. The subtitle of this conference identifies a new performative turn. I agree with and appreciate this conference's curators' care in emphasizing that indeed there have been other performative turns in the arts, and that the current one is new just in the sense that it is yet another one. By saying so, the subtitle of our gathering helps dispel any ahistorical notions of a supposedly unprecedented novelty structuring our current time's relation to live performance in the visual arts. But having said that, I feel that it is also necessary for me to say that what makes this new, not new iteration of a performative turn quite interesting is that it is basically a choreographic or dance turn. And by adding this element of choreography and dance, it would have to then to follow logically that this new performative turn is therefore doubly not new, since, as is well known, another quite important choreographic turn took place in the visual arts world some 60 years ago between 1958, and I take that date from the year of publication of Alan Capro's The Legacy of Jackson Pollock, his essay on Pollock, which is 1958, and also the premiere of a Brazilian visual artist, Lígia Pape, Concrete Ballet in 58 in Brazil. So this choreographic turn between 1958 and 1965, which is the year that Robert Morris published his Notes on Dance, and also the year in which Hélio Oiticica, the Brazilian visual artist, writes his text, Dance in My Experience, right? So basically, in thinking about a new performative turn, it's not new because there had been other performative turns. And if the new quality is to be choreographic, it's also not new because there had been a precedented one in 58 and 65. However, between this double lack of novelty, a difference emerges in the current repetition of the turn. This talk aims to identify some of the key elements structuring that particular difference. Thus, I have structured the talk in two parts or sections. A quick survey of the already mentioned choreographic turn of the late 50s, early 60s, and then some considerations on the current one. The earlier turn can be identified by a conjunction of works by artists such as Alan Capro, Robert Morris, Robert Rauschenberg in the US, Lígia Pape and Hélio Oiticica in Brazil, and many others that we could consider also be part of this interest in staging dance events like Yves Klein or the Gutai Group. Artists who more or less explicitly invoked and used dance and choreography as ways to reinvent, reimagine, and indeed re-image the very relations between the visual arts and its images and objects. Brazilian visual artist Hélio Oiticica formulated quite clearly in his 1965 text, Dance in My Experience, what was at stake in this approach to dance. His assessment can be expanded to describe an overall condition. He wrote, and I quote, "Because dance is an act, it follows that, like all acts, it is a producer of images. Moreover, as a producer of images, dance actually provided a new discovery of the image, a reinvention of the image." End of quote. Alan Capro also participated in this re-imaging of what an image might be in the visual arts by embracing not just performance in general, but dance and choreography in particular. It is well known how Capro saw in Jackson Pollock's movements and gestures, captured by Hans Namuth's camera in his famous 1951 film, an unprecedented future for painting, a future where painting would exist freed from the confines of the canvas, and where the artist's gestures and motions would take precedence over and above any inscription, marking, or tracing. Some would say metaphorically that Capro had seen in Pollock's gestural approach to painting a kind of dance. But it is much more complicated than that. First, because Capro disliked metaphors, and secondly, because for him it was never about fetishizing the movement of the artist for the sake of movement itself, which will bring us back to a modernist notion of dance, which will be also logically unbearable for Capro, who ends the essay on Pollock by saying, young artists of today need no longer say I'm a painter or a poet or a dancer, they're simply artists, right? So basically for Capro, it was really not to see that Pollock was dancing and this was beautiful, something like that, but actually something other was going on. And my proposition is that because Capro had a very rigorous commitment to form throughout his life, and even in his increasingly softly scored activities of the 80s and 90s, it was this commitment to form that led him towards choreography in the way, on the way to what he called a new concrete art that would soon be known as happenings. So this is one of the notebooks, compositional notebooks by Alan Capro, where you can see theater pieces, because this is still before he had decided on the title 18 Happenings in 6 Parts in 1959. But right on the first few pages, you see what he's after. In his seminal work, 18 Happenings in 6 Parts of 1959, conceived and performed 1 year after the publication of The Legacy of Jackson Pollock, Capro was able to structure form and to reimagine the image by inventing and activating a most rigorous choreographic device that codified everyday gestural assemblages. And here he was very concerned. There's many other drawings like this in which he tries to create a kind of cartography of laughter, all sorts of different kinds of laughter and what happens to the face, so a kind of choreography for the face, if you want. Thus, the first happening, established the ongoing performative turn of the 1950s, was methodically choreographed in the most traditional and etymological sense of the word choreography. In other words, detailed movement scoring on pages upon pages. And this is one of the ways in which Capro actually created 18 Happenings 6 Parts, which is basically choreography. And it's interesting that he did everything on paper before delivering the scores to the performers, right? So it's really the traditional notion of choreography that's going on. And it's very counterintuitive. Usually we think about happenings as just a bunch of people piling up and improvising. This would be really a choreographic approach. So detailed movement scoring on pages upon pages, and only if after all has been set down as a score, it would be then quickly distributed to the performers and actualized in space. The intriguing question is, why would Capro look for choreography in order to fulfill Pollock's legacy, the one of being dazzled by the space and objects of our everyday life? We keep the question open for now, anticipating that the answer to Capro's choreographic turn will come only belatedly, only in our current performative turn, thanks to our current choreographic imagination. But meanwhile, I propose we also go south. So this is more Capro. This is quite interesting also in 18 Happenings in 6 Parts. This is a series of instructions in which you say, he gives orders to the different performers to make moves. 1 year before Capro opens 18 Happenings in 6 Parts at the Rubin Gallery in New York City, Brazilian visual artist Lígia Pape and poet Reinaldo Jardim premiere in a theater in Copacabana in Rio de Janeiro what they call their concrete ballet, which is followed in 1959 by their neo-concrete ballet. In both cases, the critical perception at the time was that this was a momentous event in, quote, the history of contemporary visual arts in Brazil, in the words of the art critic and poet Ferreira Goulart. I am intrigued it had not been seen at the time as a momentous event in the history of dance in Brazil, right? So it's interesting to see, this is the concrete ballet of 1958, which is a series of volumes evolving in space. It's a 10, 12-minute piece where the dancers are hidden inside the forms. They're about 6 feet tall sculptures. And this is the neo-concrete ballet later, more abstract, like these two rectangular forms evolving in space. And again, like in a country with very little dance tradition, it was interesting to see that this was not a revolution in dance, but a revolution in visual arts. To reinforce my point that an earlier performative turn in the arts is indeed and essentially a choreographic one, let me cite an unpublished manuscript by another Brazilian visual artist, perhaps more well-known, Lígia Clark, a note that she typed right after she witnessed the performance of neo-concrete ballet. In that short text, Clark refers to how the evolution of the square and the rectangular forms in space in Lígia Pape's choreography revealed what Clark called the empty fullness of space. This notion of the empty full is a paradoxical yet very essential concept that Clark was pursuing herself in her own paintings through what she had called the organic line. And what is interesting is to see how it was Pape's dance or choreography that had given the organic line a kind of dynamic kinetic experience to Lígia Clark, and therefore occasioned an extraordinary revelation of a visual quest by the means of the choreographic, right? So again, like how choreography operates as a kind of machine for the visual. I mentioned earlier how Hélio Oiticica's notion of dance would bring a new condition for the image for visual arts. And this quest for a renewed image is important as well to Robert Rauschenberg, who in a long interview with Richard Konstalenetz in 1968 refers to his dance performances in the early 1960s as images. The question for Rauschenberg was to know how, from the scraps of the everyday, including the everydayness of gestures, this is Rauschenberg, including the everydayness of gestures and corporeal actions, one could extract, and I quote, the most abstract image at that particular moment. So again, like it seems that the dance experiments, this is Pelican's 1963, before it was Map Room 2, also Robert Rauschenberg. Indeed, like the question remains a question of the image, right? This rendering of the most abstract via the least abstract of reference, which is the human body, only underlines the extremes to which dance and choreography were being approached as highly transformational mechanisms, offering the visual something that perhaps even dance could not yet see for itself. And this is a point that I want to make somehow, that dance also had to go through a kind of labor in order to finally start to perform a different kind of turn. But I'll get to that point in a moment. So despite their deep differences in expression, dance was perceived by these artists as a privileged mode through which an unleashing of potentials in the visual could occur. This is why these artists' propositions do constitute a turn. What they created were not so much collaborations where objects and paintings served as props or artificial dancers, as Rosalind Krauss characterized the dialogue between dance and visual arts after World War II in Chapter 6 of Passages of Modern Sculpture. She talks about how after World War II, a series of visual artists enter into collaboration with choreographers. It seems to me that here it's not really a question of collaboration, it's a question of transformation, like a system of transforming visual arts and transforming dance into something altogether different. What these artists created or expressed was rather the desire, or at least for a moment, to have quote, a deep correspondence between visual arts and dance, that correspondence that Yvonne Rainer in 1966, in her famous essay, A Quasi-Survey of Some Minimalist Tendencies in the Quantitatively Minimal Dance Activity Midst the Plethora, or An Analysis of True Way, this is the title of her essay, A Quasi-Survey of Some Minimalist Tendencies, so on and so forth. So this is the correspondence that Yvonne Rainer identified as constituting then, quote, a concurrent history between visual arts and dance. We could go on with more examples and cite the also 1965 as also the year when Robert Morris published in the Tulane Drama Review his notes on dance, 1 year before his notes on sculpture. But maybe we could stop here in terms of the examples because I think it's established. And we have possibility to continue this. And we may start moving now towards the current non-new and yet kind of new performative turn as a choreographic and dance turn. So I brought these earlier propositions to emphasize just one single point, since what matters to our discussion is the current choreographic performative turn. And the point I want to emphasize is a point of difference, a differential point, a point of inflection or of critical break, indicating a major difference in sensibility in this new, not new, performative choreographic turn. For if we look at the examples from the late 50s and early 60s, it becomes clear that the purpose to access dance and choreography was, and despite the numerous differences in styles, influences, and context, this desire or purpose was predicated on the following major premises, two premises. The first premise was that dance was an enactment of freedom. Dance was an enactment of freedom. This premise is seen in how visual artists saw in dance a double capacity. The capacity to free the image, and this is the expression that Elliot Isika uses, from its pictorial constraints, and B, to free the object from its own system of presence. So therefore, dance was perceived as a means or a way or a mode to access freedom. Right? And the second premise is that dance perhaps was the way or the path or the bridge or the mode of actualization that would achieve that famous and always elusive fusion between art and life. That quest that propelled the whole second half of 20th century art, indeed being almost its order word, its command and commandment, that justified the turn towards life performance. So in other words, on the way to a much hoped-for fusion of art and life, dance was perceived in the late 50s and early 60s as the liberating medium through which a triple revolution could occur. Revolution of the visual, revolution of the living, and consequently, revolution of the art system itself. And simply by stating these premises today, we can see how different or how new our performative choreographic sensibility is that informs this turn. Because it seems like this notion of freedom or dance as a way to freedom no longer is possible, right? It doesn't seem to belong to our imaginary anymore. So it is at the interaction between notions of dance and revolution, image and freedom, performance and politics, art and conformity, that we find the deep difference, perhaps even the abyssal gap, between that early choreographic turn and the current one. Since it is quite obvious that the hope for a better, livable life that would be attained by a certain notion of freedom as radical deconditioning expressed emblematically by dance and its supposed relation to a freedom to move, and the hope for a better life that could still be conceived as something that could be released or accessed by art or by art in movement, it is very clear that these hopes are no longer with us. It is clearly impossible to conceive in our contemporaneity to have a vision that art can create an autonomous space of freedom expanding beyond the temporality of the work. And it is even less possible to believe that the ability to move and be moved, that to simply dance is already to achieve a true enactment of freedom. What we have instead is an awareness of the aesthetic as political and of the political as essentially choreopolitical, a generalized mobilization of endless series of movements of dissensual negotiations where life and art reveal themselves to be both and paradoxically always potentially revolutionary and yet potentially normative. So I think like it's the tension between transformative power and a normative power that the choreographic turn actually negotiates these days. So I would suggest, paradoxically, that it is precisely because of such aporias and impossibilities that dance becomes once again, and today, a central mode to a critical political or a political aesthetic theorization of what it means to still make art, to still opt for art. In still opting for art, one must embrace dance and choreography for art's sake, but it is also crucial to say that the dance that is so central in today's curatorial and artistic imaginations also had to go through a radical refiguration of itself. Contemporary dance is also dance reconceived. It is a dance that extracted itself from a whole cliché and very regulated and normative image of what dance was supposed to be, or what it should always be, of what dance should do, what it should move, how it should move, and what it should desire. So it's not just any dance that is of interest today, but a certain kind of dance that informs the current new, not new, performative choreographic turn. And this is perhaps what Cosmin and Anna was talking about the 1990s, like this major shift that occurred in choreographic imagination. And there was, those who were there remember like the strong opposition from critics and maybe dancers to all the kind of operations that were going on. So the dance that has been central to the current performative turn is one that tries to answer the question placed by the curators of our meeting, whether or not the living body is indeed the last thing left alive. And I would suggest that contemporary dance's answer to this troubling question is an unequivocally no. Nothing, not even the living body, is the last thing left alive in neoliberal hypercolonialism or opportunism. The last thing left alive today is not life, not bodies, but perhaps just whatever is piling up in some mismanaged underground. And here you can think about the recent relationship between choreographic imagination and objects, in which, again, it's not about sculpture, but about this kind of fusion between what, the no longer useful commodity and maybe a body that finds a restful ground in this kind of piling of trash, right? Everything else is not left alone and alive. But to give that answer, and to give it not as a pessimistic lament, but as a kind of lucid prognosis of the times and a kind of call for action, is also to go against deeply ingrained notions of dance as life, dance as love, dance as movement, dance as the art of bodies, dance as the art of living, dance as the art of the unsayable, dance as the art of grace, all these kind of cliches that surround dance and dance studies and dance discourse. In other words, the dance that finds itself being such a strong attractor today to contemporary visual arts and curatorial imaginations is one that also had to go through its own performative turn as well, in order to get rid of all sort of cliches attached to somatic techniques and technologies and subjectivities. So in the mid-1990s, several choreographers in very different manners found themselves relaunching the very logic and purpose of dance in the aesthetic regime of the arts. What choreographers, and some names would be Xavier, Leroy, Jérôme Bell, Esther Solomon, Vera Montero, Meg Stewart, Laribaud, Martin Spamberg, Boris Charmat, and more recently Mette Ingarsen, Maria Hassabi, and I hesitantly would say Tino Segal, but maybe he doesn't like to be called a choreographer, but perhaps it participates of this kind of choreographic imagination. It seems that all of them, despite their very many differences, they all engage in a kind of methodical, critical dismantling of a certain image of dance that was necessarily also the dismantling of old notions that actually fueled the early choreographic turn of the 60s. Namely, and again, that freedom is not always emblematically tied to the representations of free movement, And perhaps that the fusing of art and life, just like that, is not necessarily always a very good idea, given how art reifies and fuels economies of genius, the commodity of fetishisms of original works, and even how art augments and leverages speculative capital. So, having said all of this, what I'd like to then perhaps propose is that the work of these choreographers in the 90s, some of them are here present in this conference and in the past decade as well, have offered a kind of choreographic imagination that advances 5, let's say, fundamental concepts or 5 critiques that will be central to understanding why the current performative turn has to be a choreographic or dance turn. And so to conclude the talk, I'll just go over what I think very briefly are these 5 critiques. So the first critique would be related to the fact that dance is deeply tied to the notion of ephemerality. So dance's ephemerality, the fact that dance leaves no object behind after its performance, demonstrates the possibility of creating alternative economies of objecthood in the arts by showing that it is possible to create artworks away from regimes of commodification and the fetishization of tangible things. The virtuality of dance, its undocumented status, sans papier, would put it not so much in relation to remembering, which would be Peggy Phelan's paradigm regarding ephemerality, but mostly in line with the unaccountable, therefore triggering a speculative dynamics of a traceless economy, where the purely virtual leverages the whole system of value, valuation, and validation. The works of Tino Segal, that regardless of what he may say are, in my opinion, essentially choreographic, are exemplary here, both in their mode of appearing and disappearing, but also of engaging the whole museological apparatus. Or the whole, for instance, another example would be to think about the whole speculative historiography that Rajal Harrow has been engaged with his Judson series. So this will be the first critique, right? The notion of ephemerality. The second one is corporeality. Dance's inescapable corporeality constantly demonstrates to dancers and to audiences alike concrete possibilities for embodying otherwise, since a dancer's labor is nothing else than to embody, disembody, and re-embody, thus refiguring corporeality and proposing improbable subjectivities. I like, for instance, Xavier Leroy's experiments in this kind of archival possibilities of embodying, re-embodying, disembodying in relationship to Buteau, right? Also the low pieces, and perhaps even a conductor, right? So this notion of embody, re-disembodying. Despite not wanting to be too theoretical here, indeed there is a proposition from within dance that is immanent to dance that demands that no matter what, one must always make for oneself a body that is aligned or in tune, resonant, or adequate to the forces and elements composing a situation. This kind of transformative power can be seen before our eyes, for instance, in Xavier Leroy's Product of Another Circumstances, or even in this retrospective, as an unfolding of corporeal possibilities that take place between the critical, the theoretical, the affective, and the utopian. So this would be the second aspect. The third aspect has to do with the notion of precariousness. Dance has an intimate relationship to the notion of precariousness, which springs at a physical level from dance's necessary and ongoing play with forces, and at a social level from its subaltern position in the general economy of the arts. We can say it performs, bespeaks, and underlines the current implacable and problematic precarization of life as well, brought on by the momentarily triumphant neoliberal globalization of financial capitalism set in motion since the early 1990s. Precariousness also proposes another alternative narration to dance's materiality, one where, and I quote, Brazilian performance theoretician Eleonora Fabião, precariousness proposes an alternative narration to dance's materiality, where, quote, a biopoetics and a biohistory of precariousness approximate time and matter in such a way that their claims for autonomy are diluted. Precariousness is the performance of time and matter's distinct sameness. Time becomes a force of matter, and matter becomes a force of time. The fourth one has to do with the relationship of scoring. Dance's deep relationship to scoring, as we saw in Alan Capro's scores, but also we can see in other scores from the 90s by visual artists, and, or from Yoko Ono. These are separated by 30 years, these two scores. Dance's deep relationship to scoring or choreographing exposes all those commanding and imperative forces embedded in the practice of choreography. As a system of command, choreographic scoring reveals the formation of obedient, disciplined, and preformatted bodies, technically and subjectively fit to produce, and more importantly perhaps, to reproduce certain images conveyed by an authorial will. A crucial element in the formation of dance as an art form, choreography as a technology of scoring, does have inevitable political reverberations across contemporary art practices, since choreography, once enacted, displays disciplined bodies operating in a regime of obedience for the sake of bringing an art piece into the world. Here we might think of the early performance scores by Bruce Nauman that invariably start with the innocent yet very telling line, hire a dancer. Right? This is a very common first line in Bruce Nauman's. Hire a dancer and then ask him to do a bunch of things. Right? So this notion of scoring command is also one that ties, again, back to the question of economy and to the question of labor. Right? And then finally, maybe as a fifth possibility of thinking about why is it so important to think about dance today in relationship to live performance, is the relationship to dance and performativity. Because dance does what it sets up itself to do, because it always establishes a contract or a promise between choreographic planning and its actualization in movement, it inevitably reveals an essential performativity at the core of its aesthetic project. If you understand by performativity a general theory of the ways in which citational effects are implemented and reproduced, and where statements, and particularly promises, acquire world-making force. This is basically like performativity in kind of Derridian, Butlerian vein. This link between dance and performativity demonstrates a non-metaphoric implementation or actualization of that which preconditions dance, endless citationality of an always singular yet always dispersed or semi-absent source, which nevertheless insists on making a dance return. So once we take all these aspects, and I'm almost done, I think is it still, okay, how many? 5 minutes? Okay. So once we take all these aspects, which again, I believe are all constitutive of dance as an aesthetic practice, and are perhaps dance's main identity traits within the aesthetic regimes of the arts, it starts to become quite clear why dance appears as an energizing and catalyzing element in contemporary art and critical thought. It is It is important to clarify that in these cases, and again, as I said before, it is not a question of collaboration between the visual arts and dance. We should rather speak here of a generative will to confuse the arts away from neat divisions. But that add to that liberating impetus that comes from the 60s, such fusion or confusion is driven by a dynamic and mobilizing force of articulation between not only life and art, but life and life, art and art, through this mode of dance. So movement in politics, movement in economic and social formations, movement in commodities, movement in the logic of what Stefano Harney calls logisticality. Throughout the later 20th century, all these movements obviously also manifested themselves in cultural production and artistic practice. They led many artists to link their practice directly to questions of freedom and participation, sometimes even aiming radically to recast the whole conception of man and of the human. This double junction of politics and subjectivity within the aesthetic proposed an imperative for the arts to experiment, which since the late 50s was linked to a particular mode of enacting such experimentation, which is to perform. Thus bound together, to experiment became to animate the body's capacities and potencies beyond and besides formations of the human as general category for subjectivity. To experiment was to open up the body to new areas of the sensible, the perceptible, and the meaningful, of what moves whom, of affects and sensations as corporeal assemblages. Thus, to experiment meant to get closer to problems deeply linked to questions that are constitutive of dance and choreography. And just to finalize, I would say that what was clear also, and I just wanted to say that, is that it's not that dance has the natural solutions for these problems. As I said, dance also had to find its own modes of experimenting and performing and even going against its own identities, if you want, within the modernist regimes. So in that sense, dance also had to go through a performative turn that linked it back to the visual arts. And just looking at the images before that you showed in the museum of the Godard film and also the performance of Mujin running in the museum, I was thinking how it was so important in the early 90s for, before this kind of articulation between dance and the museum was so present, for choreographers to reinvent the black box as a white box. It was almost as if, like, I'm thinking of Self Unfinished, I'm thinking about Powered by Emotion by Martin Spamberg, I'm thinking about certain pieces by Larribot and many others, in which all of a sudden the black box was not good enough anymore. And you had almost like to stage a gallery in the theater. So it's almost as if you had to start bringing indications of that different kind of architecture into the space as a kind of anticipation of what was about to come. So I guess this is what I have to say. And so with this, I would say that we can finally say that the new, not new performative turn is in fact a new one, finally. And it is worthwhile reminding here how Gilles Deleuze describes the new as not, quote, the same as the fashionable, but on the contrary, the variable creativity which arises out of dispositives. And this is exactly what I feel, somehow dance and choreography has been operating recently, which is precisely to reflect back on all the dispositives that set it in place, economic, corporeal, subjectively, anatomical, so on and so forth, and from there gather a kind of variable creativity arising out of these dispositives. So that's it, and thank you.